Today's Daf Yomi is sponsored by Mordechai and Aviva Weissman in memory of Leibel Chaim Ben Leibel Aviva Dr. Philip Rodkin. We're going to start on the bottom of 58b. The Gemara raises the following question, 2 lines from the bottom on the bottom of 58b. As a background, we know that there's 2 basic laws we need to remember for today's Daf Yomi. That there are 2 stages in marriage according to halacha. One stage is called the erusin, which is betrothal or engaged, but it's formal engagement, that a divorce is required to separate. And the other is what's called nisuin, the full marriage. The second background law is that a girl, there are 3 stages in a girl's maturity according to Jewish law. There is what's called ketana, that's when she's under the age of 12. Then there's na'ara, when she's from the age of 12 to 12 and a half. And then there's a bogeres, when she's a full adult, which is from the age of 12 and a half up. Obviously, these ideas are very, very unfamiliar, disturbing, concerning to us, because today we would never marry a girl who's 12 and a half years old, but that's what they consider an adult. So, by Minei Rav Chiya Bar Yosef Mishmuel. So, Rav Chiya Bar Yosef asked the following question from Shmuel: Kohen Gadol shekidesh esaketana uvegara tachtav mahu. The Kohen Gadol was required to marry a virgin. The verse tells us the Kohen Gadol has to marry a besula. But this idea, the Gemara understands is, and we'll see in the Mishnah, not only does he have to marry a virgin, he also cannot marry a girl who's in a bogeres. The Kohen Gadol was not allowed to marry a girl who is a bogeres, i.e. 12 and a half years old and up. So the question here is, let's say the Kohen Gadol betrothed her when she was a minor. That was the erusin, uvegara tachtav. And now, before he fully married her, before he consummated the marriage with nisuin, i.e. that he took her into his home and he completely married her, she became an adult. So since he betrothed her when she was a minor, is he allowed now to fully marry her when she's an adult or not? So, the question, the answer is, the Gemara says, what's the story? On top of 59a, Basar nisuin azlinan, ubasar erusin azlinan. Do we follow the nisuin or do we follow the erusin? Meaning to say, do we say that since she's an adult now, he's not allowed to marry her? Or do we say since he betrothed her when she was a minor, therefore he's going to still be allowed to marry her now? So Rabbi Chiya Bar Yosef asks this question of Shmuel, and Shmuel responds to Nisua. This was something we learned in our Mishnah. Because what did our Mishnah say? Our Mishnah had said that if somebody have done a disqualifying marriage, i.e. they married, let's say a Kohen Gadol married a widow or a Kohen married a divorcee, if they fully married, they had an nisuin, then she's never allowed to go back to her father's home and eat the truma. But if they were from the erusin only, then they're allowed to go back to their father's home and eat the truma. So we learned nisarmu and niskarshu min nisuin pisulos. If they had become fully married, then she's disqualified. Min erusin kasheros. But if it was from the betrothal, then it was kashera. So we see from here. So what's the proof from this? We see from here that when it comes to just being disqualified from the kahuna, it goes via the nisuin. And so too, it means if she's an adult, by the time of the nisuin, then he can't marry her. The Gemara says that Rabbi Chiya Bar Yosef responds to Shmuel, no, in order to determine that she's disqualified, that I wasn't asking. I'm sure that she only becomes disqualified from the nisuin. I know that it's the bia that makes her disqualified. Where I asked this question was about whether or not it's considered marrying her as a virgin, because it says the Kohen Gadol that the Kohen Gadol must marry a virgin. What does that mean? Does it mean he needs to betroth her when she's a virgin, or he needs to marry her when she's a virgin? So Shmuel says, this is also a Mishnah. We're going to get to this on Shabbos stuff. It says, Ires es almana, let's say he betrothed the widow, Vinismana lios kohen gadol. Let's say he betrothed the widow, and then so the Kohen, so he was a regular Kohen. His name was, let's say, his name was Isaac the Kohen, right? He's a regular Kohen, and he betroths her. No problem. She's not a widow. He's allowed to marry a widow. He's just a regular Kohen. But then what happened was, after he betrothed her as a regular Kohen, then he became appointed Kohen Gadol. So is he allowed to do the nisuin with her? And we say that under those circumstances, he's allowed to complete the marriage because he had betrothed her before he was a Kohen Gadol. So we see from here that this case is the same. That just like a minor girl, if he married her when she was a minor, he should be allowed to fully marry her even though she's an adult. Morris says, no, that case is totally different. There's a distinction between the cases. Shani Hasam, that case is different. Yikach isha. Because there it says he shall take her as his wife. And the extra word, what does it mean, isha? That it states there. It says this isha is extra. And from the extra word isha here, we learn that if he betrothed her as a widow and then he became appointed Kohen Gadol, he can continue to marry her. The Gemara says, well, but also by this case, it says, so it says also the word isha here also. So maybe here also it means the same idea that if he married her while she was a minor, he can continue the marriage while she's an adult. The Gemara says, no, no, only one of these verses is enough to teach us this extra idea that he can continue and not the second one. So why are we choosing to say that if he married her while she was a widow, he could continue, before he was Kohen Gadol, he can continue the marriage when he becomes appointed Kohen Gadol, whereas if he betrothed her when she was a minor, he can't continue it. What's the difference? In the case where he betrothed her when she was a minor, her body changed. So therefore, he's not going to be able to maybe remain with her as an adult. Whereas in the other case, her body didn't change, and therefore he could remain with her when she's an adult. Okay, so now we're up to the next Mishnah. The next Mishnah states, it's really a continuation of the same theme. The Mishnah states, Kohen Gadol lo yisa, Kohen Gadol lo yisa almana. A Kohen Gadol is not allowed to marry a widow. The high priest cannot marry a widow, bein almana min ha'erisin, whether she was just betrothed, meaning to say, whether she's just a widow from a state of betrothal, or bein almana min ha'nesuin, or whether she's a widow from a full marriage, he cannot marry her. And he's also not allowed to marry a girl over 12 and a half. He has to marry a minor. Whereas Rebbe Lezer, or a nara, or a katana, or a nara. Whereas Rebbe Lezer, Rebbe Shimon, machshirin bebogeres. Rebbe Lezer, Rebbe Shimon allow him to marry her if she's over 12 and a half years old. Whereas Rebbe Lezer, Rebbe Shimon say he's not allowed to marry her if she is mukas eitz. What's mukas eitz? And eitz is a stick, and muka if she was struck by a stick. What this means is a woman has, protecting her virginity, she has a hymen. And the hymen can be ruptured in two ways. It could be ruptured through the sexual act, or it could be ruptured through a stick. So Rebbe Lezer, Rebbe Shimon are saying he's not allowed to marry her if her hymen was ruptured, even if it was not ruptured during bia. Bia is the word that we're going to use when we're referring to sex. So Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, almana lo yikach. It says in the verse, you're not allowed to marry a widow, which means bein almana min ha'erisin, bein almana min ha'nesuin. It said in the Mishnah, you can't marry a widow if she was widowed from the state of engagement, or the widow from the full marriage. And Gemara says, Pshita, well, that's obvious. Of course you can't marry her if she's a widow from engaged. It says it in the verse. No, the Gemara says, no, you might have thought, almana mitamar. You might have thought we're going to learn out the word widow from the way it appears by Tamar. And just like by Tamar, it calls Tamar a widow, and there it's referring to her in a state of nisuin, in a full marriage. So I might have thought here too, when it refers to a widow, it also refers to a widow from a full marriage. So we don't say that. Even almana, even a widow from a betrothed state, The Kohen Gadol can't marry her. Or the Gemara says, but maybe that is what it means. Only a widow from a full marriage. The Gemara says, no, dumya de grusha. No, it's similar to a case of a divorcee. Because ma grusha, just like a divorcee who a regular Kohen cannot marry, and also a Kohen Gadol can't marry, is Beiman on Isu and Beiman on Yevamos. And he can't marry her if she was divorced from the engagement or the divorce from the full marriage. And also a widow, whether it's from the full or the betrothed part. Mara says, according to the Tanakh of our Mishnah, she's not allowed to marry an adult. Not allowed to marry an adult. So the Gemara says, Tana Rabbanan, so the rabbis taught, V'hu isha b'vsuel yikach. How do we know, what's the basis of the position of the Tanakh that a Kohen Gadol is not allowed to marry an adult? It says, V'hu isha b'vsuel yikach. The verse says he's supposed to marry a virgin. And that words are telling us, Prat l'bogeres shekola b'suel. It comes to exclude a bogeres because he can't marry her because her hymen has already begun to recede. As she gets older, the membrane starts to disintegrate. So therefore, he's not able to marry her. Whereas Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon, machshirim b'bogeres, they say the Kohen Gadol can marry an adult. Why? So they say that even though she's a bogeres, he can marry her. But what are they arguing about? Rabbi Meir savar besula afilu miktas besulam. Rabbi Meir's other position. Since the verse, if it would say in the verse besula, just the regular word for virgin, afilu miktas besulam, that even if she was a partial virgin, he can marry her. Besuel, but since it says the word besuel, adiika kol habsulim. It means that she needs to be a complete virgin. So that's why Meir says she needs to be a complete virgin in order to marry her. And then it says, bivsuah, it adds the extra bet. So Rabbi Meir teaches us that, it says that this teaches us, bikadarka in, shelo kadarka lo. Rabbi Meir says that when we say she needs to be a complete virgin in order to marry her, means say she needs to be 12 and a half. But Rabbi Meir also has a leniency, and his leniency is that if she's a virgin, kadarka is the normal bia, then we're going to say that that's what's necessary for him to marry her as a virgin. But if she had lost her virginity, shelo kedarka. What's shelo kedarka? Shelo kedarka is anal intercourse. If she had lost her virginity in that manner, then she is not going to be considered then she's still going to be considered a virgin according to Rabbi Meir. So Meir says she has to be under 12 and a half. But if she lost her virginity, shelo kedarka, that does not disqualify her. But Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon, they take the opposite opinion in both cases. Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon, savri besua. If it had just said besua, then it would have meant besua shlema. She had to be completely virgin. Besua shlema mashma besua. But since it says besua, afilu miktas besuin. Even if she was just a partial virgin, then she's going to be a afilu miktas besuim. Even if she was just a partial virgin, she's going to be allowed to marry him. Meaning, even if she's over 12 and a half. But Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon have a stringency. Bivsuleha, it means achi you kol bisuleha kayamin. Bein bekadarka bein shelo kedarka. Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon say she needs to be a complete virgin, meaning to say both bia kedarka, the normal bia, and also bia shelo kedarka, also the irregular bia. If either one of those have been compromised, she's no longer considered a virgin, and he cannot marry her. So it's a double dispute. That Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon say she could be over 12 and a half, but she cannot have been compromised by bia shelo kedarka. So Rabbi Meir says she has to be under 12 and a half, but if she had bia shelo kedarka, she's still a virgin. So Amar Rabbi Yehuda Marav teaches us nivoa shelo kedarka, that if she has this bia shelo kedarka, pisua. So they seem at first glance to be ruling like Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon, that if she had bia shelo kedarka, she's disqualified with kahuna. She can no longer be with the Kohen Gadol. So Rava challenges this because why? Because it says v'lo siel isha. It says in the pasuk says. Now here we're dealing with a different situation. Here we're dealing about a case where you're ma'anes a woman, where Rahman al-Aslan, a person that sexually assaults a woman. The law of the Torah is that he has to pay the father 50 pieces of silver, and then he has to marry her if she wants. So If she wants, she could say no. But if she says yes, he has to marry her. So the verse states that she will be to him as a wife. And the rabbis darshan on that basis in the Brisa, it says, B'isha ha'ru'uya lo, the woman who is ru'uya to be married to him. Prat la'amano l'kohen gadol. This comes to exclude the case of a widow to a kohen gadol. That if the kohen gadol was ma'anis this woman, he's not allowed to marry her. Ugrusha chalutza l'kohen hedjud, and or also a regular kohen who was ma'anis a woman who was divorcee. So the Gemara says, well, what's the circumstance that we're talking about? Hey, chidami, what are we talking about? Ilema b'kedarka, if he was ma'anis her with regular bia, ma'irya mishum amana, why are we saying that the kohen gadol can't marry her because she's a widow? Typically, mishum dahavi le'beula, must be that you say he can't marry her because she had bia because she's no longer a virgin. So it must be elav shelo kedarka. It must be that the bia was shelo kedarka and she's still a virgin, and so therefore mishum amana and mishum beula. So she's considered to be, you can't marry her because she's a widow, but not because she's a non-virgin. So we see from here on top of the Testament base, why would Rav say that it be a shelo kedarka is considered to be a loss of virginity when this brisa implies that be a shelo kedarka is nothing to do with bria shelo kedarka is not bia. So Gemara says, yeah, Rav is not, this brisa is not a contradiction. We're on top of the Testament base. The Gemara is saying that the brisa is not a contradiction because this brisa is Rabbi Meir and Rav holds like Rebbe Lazar. Rebbe Lazar in our Mishnah says bia shelo kedarka is bia. So this brisa says bia shelo kedarka is not bia. That's Rabbi Meir. The Rav Da'amar Rebbe Lazar, or Rav passing like Rebbe Lazar, who says that bia shelo kedarka is bia. So therefore it says bia shelo kedarka is that bia shelo kedarka. That Rebbe Lazar had said that bia shelo kedarka we had said was right. That Rav holds like that bia shelo kedarka is bia, and this price is like Rebbe Meir says bia shelo kedarka is not bia. So the rest says, well, Rebbe Lazar, if Rav holds like Rebbe Lazar says bia shelo kedarka is bia, my area mishum beula. So why do we say? So we still have another problem because granted. It's bia, but typically, but why would Rav have to tell us he can't marry her because it's the bia? Typically, the Avle Zona. Rav could have just said she's also a Zona because a woman who engages in lewd behavior is prohibited to marry a Kohen. And Rebbe Lazar says, he says any single man with a single woman creates a Zona if they're together, and he has a strict position that any single man who's with any single woman, she's going to no longer be able to marry a Kohen. We don't paskin like that. We paskin that if the woman was with that a Kohen's not allowed to marry a woman who is in a relationship that would be prohibited if they tried to get married. But if they were just single Jews, then it would be okay. But anyway, so why does Rav have to say that this is a case of bia shelo kedarka will disqualify, or it's a case of zona? So Rav Yosef could go and shenivel ala behema. No, we're talking about a situation where she had the bia shelo kedarka, but it would not make her a zona. Why? Because she had the bia shelo kedarka with an animal, and so therefore Rav is saying that she's no longer a virgin, but she is under these circumstances not a zona. That's what he's saying. Because she lost her virginity, she can't marry the Kohen Gadol for that reason. But she's no longer a harlot. So the Gemara says, Abaye says, no way, we reject that. He says to his Rebbe Yosef, Mimanav Shach, doesn't make sense. If you want to say that bia shelo kedarka with an animal is considered bia zona nami havi, then it's also a zona. If it is zona lo havia, and then if it's not a zona, then be'ula nami lo havia, then it's also not bia. And if you want to say midi dehavia mukas eight shelo kedarka, and if you want to say no, according to Rebbe Lezer, Rebbe Shimon, the animal will not make her a zona, but it'll make her a mukas eight, so it'll make it like her hymen is ruptured, and therefore, if you have this mukas eights in the rear, that's going to be considered like you lost your virginity, not just by the hymen, but also in the rear cavity. Well, then there's no woman who's going to be able to marry a Kohen, because every woman has some sort of penetration of the rear while she cleans herself after going to the bathroom. They used to clean themselves with stones. It was harsher, but for sure, every woman would be considered mukas eitz that way if we judged it on the basis of mukas eitz in the rear, not just by the hymen. So what's a circumstance? We could have such a circumstance. How can we have a circumstance where Rab needed to tell us that if you had to be a shalok kadarka, she's disqualified to be with the Kohen? What's a mima'anes? Mima'anes is a girl who was married off by her mother or brother after her father had died, and she was married off under the age of 12. So she has the right, since it's just a rabbinic marriage, she has the right to refuse the marriage before 12. So it's possible that she could have lost her virginity. So through Bia Shalok Kadarka, but she would not be, so we under those circumstances that if he had to be a Shalok Kadarka with her and then he rejected her, she's not prohibited because of lewd behavior, because she was married. She's not prohibited because of a divorcee, because she wasn't divorced. She rejected it. She's not prohibited because of a widow, because her husband was alive. So why is she being prohibited? Only because she lost her virginity because of Bia Shalok Kadarka. And that's what Rav is teaching us. Amar Rav Shimi bar Chia, Nivala lebehema kasher lekahuna. So Rav Shimi bar Chia teaches us that if there was the Bia through an animal, she could still marry the Kohen Gadol. Yes, if she had witnesses and a warning, she'd be put to death. But in a situation where there's no witnesses and no warning, then she can marry the Kohen Gadol. And Tanya Nami Hachi, we also learned in the Brisa, Nivalo and Misha Eno Ish, let's say it's your relations with somebody who's not a man, i.e. an animal. Some say, there are some commentaries that discuss a woman who has relations with a demon, but here let's say she has relations with someone who's not a man. Alpha Bisha Beskila, even though if there would be witnesses, she'd get stoned for it, because she could marry the Kohen Gadol now. Kiasa Rav Dimi, Amar, lest you think this is just rabbinic, ludicrous examples. He says it happened one time. There was this place called Hitlo. It was a woman. She was cleaning out her house. The Rava Kalev Kufri Me'acharana, a large dog pounced upon her. Rabbi said she could still marry the Kohen, and Amar Shmuel, Kohen Gadol. And Shmuel says she could still marry the Kohen Gadol. And the Gemara asks, "May Rabbi Kohen Gadol? May other Rabbi lived around the year 200? In those days, there was no temple anymore. Ella Ru'uyah Kohen Gadol. She would be capable of marrying a Kohen Gadol because if the Beis Hamikdash was around, because the bia with the animal does not disqualify her from marrying the Kohen Gadol." Amalei Rava Miparkin or Ravashi Mina Melsadam Rabbanan. How did the rabbis know this? What's the source of the idea that if you have bia with an animal, it's not going to be considered bia to disqualify you from the Kohen Gadol? Because it says in the verse, Lo savi esnan zona umachir kelev. It says in the verse, you're not allowed to bring to the temple as an offering the esnan zona. If a man was with a harlot and he paid her a sheep, she can't bring that sheep to the temple as an offering. Umachir kelev. And also, let's say you traded a dog for a sheep, you can't bring that sheep to the temple as an offering. Utanan, and we learned, Esnan kelav umuchir zona mutar. But if you reversed it and you said to the harlot, sleep with my dog and I'll give you a sheep in return for that she could bring to the temple. Or if you sold a harlot for a sheep, that you could bring to the temple. So we see from here that if the harlot slept with the dog, you could bring that sheep to the temple. That proves, says Rashi, that sleeping with the animal is not considered to be sleeping with is not considered to be znus, and therefore it's allowed. And therefore, it's not that it's allowed, but it's not going to be disqualifying for the kahuna. As it states, only two of those situations are disqualifying and not four. Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, so the Kohen Gadol was required to marry a virgin, but let's say he assaulted a woman himself. So she lost his virginity, but through his action. Mefusas is where he seduced her. And seduced her, he either has to pay the 50 shkalim or marry her. So then under those circumstances, lo yisa, ideally the Kohen Gadol should not marry because it says besua yikach, he has to take her when she's a virgin, but in this case she lost her virginity to him. So he ideally should not marry her. Vim nasa nasa, if he didn't marry her, she's fully married. Anusas chavera, mufusas chavera lo yisa, but if she was assaulted by his friend, or seduced by his friends, he's not allowed to marry. And if he did marry her, under those circumstances, we're going to say it's a valid marriage, but he's obligated to divorce her. And the offspring will be halal, disqualified from the kahuna, and it's not a kohen. We're going to discuss that more on tomorrow's daf. So let's stop here. If anybody has any questions about this very, very difficult